I woke up from a coma pregnant. My husband had a vasectomy 8 years ago. The neurologist was explaining something about brain plasticity when I felt it. A flutter, low in my abdomen, unmistakable and impossible. Dr. Kensington kept talking about my recovery timeline. 6 weeks in a medically induced coma after the car accident. Remarkable progress, minimal cognitive damage. But I wasn't listening anymore. My hand moved to my stomach under the hospital blanket, pressing gently, feeling the curve that shouldn't be there. When I looked down, I could see it, a slight swell beneath the thin cotton gown. My husband Declan sat in the chair by the window, his face gaunt from weeks of worry, nodding along with the doctor's words. I interrupted them both, my voice rough from disuse. "I think I'm pregnant." Dr. Kensington stopped mid-sentence, and Declan's head snapped toward me, his expression shifting from concern to confusion. The doctor smiled, that patronizing smile medical professionals use when patients say something illogical. "Mrs. Garrett, that's likely just some bloating from the feeding tube and immobility," she continued. "Your body has been through significant trauma." "No," I said more firmly this time. "I'm pregnant. I can feel it moving." The room went silent, except for the beeping of monitors. Declan stood up slowly, his face pale. "Sweetheart, that's not possible. You've been unconscious for 6 weeks. Before that, we hadn't been intimate in months because of your work schedule. Plus, I had that vasectomy 8 years ago, remember? We decided after the twins were born." Dr. Kensington pulled out her tablet, scrolling through my medical records with a frown deepening across her face. "We did multiple scans during your treatment. There was no indication of pregnancy. Let me call for an ultrasound right now, just to rule this out and ease your mind." The way she said it made it clear she thought I was confused, possibly experiencing some post-coma delusion. But I knew my own body. I'd been pregnant twice before with our twin daughters, and this feeling was unmistakable. The ultrasound technician arrived 20 minutes later, wheeling in the portable machine with an expression that suggested she'd been briefed on the situation. She squeezed gel onto my stomach, her movements efficient and professional. The wand pressed against my skin, and within seconds, the room filled with a sound that made everyone freeze. A heartbeat, fast and strong, echoing through the monitor speakers. The technician's face went from skeptical to shocked in the span of a breath. "There it is," she said quietly, turning the screen toward us. 20 weeks gestation based on measurements, perfectly healthy fetal development. The image showed unmistakably what I already knew, a baby curled and moving, fingers visible near its face. Declan made a sound like all the air had left his body. Dr. Kensington grabbed the monitor, staring at the screen like it might change if she looked hard enough. "This doesn't make any sense. We've done 3 CT scans, 2 MRIs. How did we miss this?" The technician saved several images, her hands shaking slightly. "Sometimes early pregnancy doesn't show clearly on scans focused on brain trauma, but at 20 weeks, this should have been obvious on any abdominal imaging." She looked at Dr. Kensington with an expression I couldn't read. "This is going to need documentation, a lot of it." Declan hadn't moved from his spot by my bed. His face had gone from pale to gray. 20 weeks means you got pregnant right before the accident, but we hadn't been together in 3 months before that. I remember because I was traveling for work. I tried to sit up, but my muscles were still weak from 6 weeks of immobility. "Declan, I was in a coma. I don't know how this happened." His eyes met mine, and I saw something I'd never seen there before. Doubt, raw and undeniable. The technician quickly left with her equipment, muttering about getting the attending physician. Dr. Kensington stood there looking between us, clearly realizing this had moved beyond medical mystery into something else entirely. "Mr. Garrett, would you step outside with me for a moment?" Declan followed her without a word, leaving me alone with the monitor still showing my vitals. My heart rate had spiked, the numbers climbing as panic set in. Through the partially open door, I could hear their voices, Declan's rising in pitch, asking how this was possible, demanding answers. Dr. Kensington's responses were measured but firm, explaining the medical facts while carefully avoiding the obvious implication hanging in the air between them, that somehow, while unconscious, I'd gotten pregnant. 20 minutes passed before Declan came back in. His face was composed now, that blank expression he used when dealing with difficult clients at his law firm. He sat down in the chair, not at my bedside, but across the room. The distance felt intentional. Dr. Kensington wants to run genetic testing on the baby. Her tone suggested this wasn't a request. I felt my chest tighten. You think I cheated on you? He didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. I think something happened that doesn't make sense, and we need answers. The hospital moved me to a private room within the hour. Nurses came and went, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something that looked like judgment. One of them, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, lingered after checking my IV. I've been a nurse for 30 years, never seen anything like this. She adjusted my pillow, her voice dropping to a whisper. But I've heard stories, women who get pregnant under impossible circumstances. Usually there's an explanation that everyone missed. Usually. The word hung there, loaded with implication. That night, Declan went home to be with our daughters, 12-year-old twins who'd been staying with his mother during my hospitalization. He kissed my forehead before leaving, but the gesture felt automatic, empty of the warmth that usually lived in his touch. Dr. Kensington stopped by around 9 p.m. with a tablet full of consent forms. We need to do an amniocentesis for genetic testing. It's the only way to determine paternity conclusively. She paused. And to make sure the baby is developing normally given the unusual circumstances of your pregnancy. I signed everything with shaking hands. What unusual circumstances? I was unconscious. She met my eyes directly. Mrs. Garrett, you were under 24-hour supervision in intensive care. There's documented proof of everyone who entered your room, every nurse, every doctor, every visitor. We have security footage. If something happened, we'll find out what. The implications of her words made my stomach turn. You think someone assaulted me while I was in a coma? Her silence was answer enough. The amniocentesis happened the next morning. The needle going into my belly felt like violation layered on top of violation, extracting fluid that would either prove my innocence or destroy my marriage. Dr. Kensington assured me results would take 5 to 7 days for the full genetic panel. DNA paternity testing would be faster, maybe 3 days if we prioritized it. She scheduled a meeting with hospital administration and their legal team for that afternoon. This has potential liability implications, she explained. If someone on our staff violated you while you were incapacitated, we need to know immediately. The hospital's legal team consisted of 3 people in expensive suits who sat across from me asking questions that felt like accusations dressed in professional language. Exactly when did you last have intercourse with your husband before the accident? Are you certain about that timeline? Is there any possibility you could have been pregnant before the accident and not known? Could there have been any other partner in the weeks leading up to your hospitalization? Each question chipped away at my dignity until I was crying, unable to answer anymore. Declan sat beside me, his jaw clenched, saying nothing. Hospital security reviewed 6 weeks of footage from the ICU. Every person who entered my room was documented, time-stamped, their credentials verified, nurses, doctors, respiratory therapists, cleaning staff, Declan and his mother during visiting hours, my sister twice in the first week. Everyone was accounted for. The security director, a former police officer named Milo Vance, presented his findings in a conference room filled with hospital administrators. No unauthorized access, no gaps in coverage. Everyone who entered had legitimate medical reasons and was never alone with the patient for more than necessary clinical time. So, how did this happen? Declan's voice cut through the room. My wife was in a medically induced coma for 6 weeks, and somehow she's 20 weeks pregnant? That means she got pregnant right before the accident. But I had a vasectomy 8 years ago, and we hadn't been intimate in months before her accident. Someone in this hospital has to know something. The administrators exchanged glances. Mr. Garrett, we understand your frustration, but the evidence suggests whatever happened, it didn't happen here, which leaves only one other possibility. That I got pregnant before the accident, I said flatly, from someone who wasn't my husband? The room fell silent. That's what you're all thinking, isn't it? That I was having an affair and the coma is just convenient timing. Dr. Kensington leaned forward. We're not making accusations, we're trying to find facts. The genetic testing will tell us more. She turned to Declan. But I have to ask, is there any possibility your vasectomy failed? It's rare, but documented. Perhaps you should get your fertility tested before we jump to conclusions about infidelity. Declan's expression shifted. He hadn't considered that. The hospital arranged for him to see a urologist that same day. The testing was quick, results definitive. His vasectomy was intact and functioning perfectly. Sperm count? 0. The urologist's report was clinical and absolute. No possibility of natural conception. Which brought us right back to the impossible question. If Declan couldn't be the father and I was in a coma when I got pregnant, then who was responsible for the baby growing inside me? My sister Veronica came to visit on day 3 of my consciousness. She brought flowers and magazines, sitting beside my bed with tears streaming down her face. I thought I was going to lose you. When Declan called saying you'd crashed your car into that guardrail, I couldn't breathe. She held my hand, squeezing gently. But you're here. You're awake. That's what matters. I told her about the pregnancy, watched her face cycle through disbelief, shock, and finally something that looked like fear. That's impossible. You've been unconscious. I know, but here we are, 20 weeks along with a baby that shouldn't exist. Veronica pulled back slightly. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to me. Have you thought about termination? Given the circumstances, no one would judge you. The question felt like a betrayal. This is my baby, Veronica. I don't know how it happened, but it's growing inside me. I can feel it move. How can I just end that? She looked away. Because Declan thinks you cheated. Everyone thinks you cheated. And if you keep this baby, your marriage is over. The words hung between us, brutal and true. Declan had barely spoken to me since the vasectomy results came back. He slept in the chair across the room instead of the fold-out bed beside me. His mother had stopped calling. The twins hadn't visited yet, probably because he didn't know how to explain this to my 12-year-old daughters, asking why mommy was pregnant when daddy said they were done having kids years ago. How do you explain that their mother might have destroyed their family while unconscious? Dr. Kensington came in during visiting hours, interrupting my spiral of thoughts. She held a tablet and wore an expression I couldn't read. The preliminary DNA results are back. I need to discuss them with you and your husband together. She looked at Veronica. I'm sorry, but this is private. My sister left reluctantly, and Dr. Kensington waited until Declan arrived from work. He came in still wearing his suit, looking exhausted. His eyes barely met mine before focusing on the doctor. Just tell us, is it mine? Dr. Kensington pulled up data on her tablet. The baby shares 50% of Mrs. Garrett's DNA, as expected, but the paternal DNA is unusual. It shows markers consistent with your genetic profile, Mr. Garrett, but not a complete match. It's more like a sibling relationship than a parent-child one. She paused, letting that sink in. Do you have a brother? Declan's face went white. I have a twin, Preston. He's been deployed overseas for a year, military, stationed in Germany. The implications crashed over us like a wave. Dr. Kensington continued carefully. This baby is genetically related to you through your twin brother, which means if he's the father, we need to understand how that happened while your wife was in a coma, unless there's something you're not telling us. Declan looked at me, and I saw his expression shatter. His twin brother, the man who looked exactly like him, sounded exactly like him, the brother who'd visited me in the hospital when Declan needed to be with the girls. I remembered now, fragments through the fog of sedation. Preston had been granted emergency leave when they told my family I might not survive. He'd flown back from Germany, stayed at Declan's house, helped with the twins, and he'd visited me in ICU. The nurses would have let him in because he looked identical to my husband. They would have assumed he had every right to be there. Dr. Kensington was watching my face. Mrs. Garrett, do you remember anything? Any moments of consciousness during your coma? No, I whispered. But sometimes patients can hear things, respond to stimuli, even while sedated, right? She nodded slowly. It's called covert consciousness. Some coma patients show brain activity suggesting awareness even when they appear completely unconscious. We didn't test for that in your case because your sedation was medically necessary, but theoretically, there could have been moments of semi-consciousness we didn't detect, moments where you might have been aware but unable to respond or remember clearly later. Declan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You're saying my brother assaulted her while she was unconscious? That he used his access to her room to rape her? His voice was getting louder with each word. And somehow she was conscious enough to conceive, but not conscious enough to remember or fight back? Dr. Kensington raised her hands in a calming gesture. I'm not saying anything yet. We need more information. But yes, that's one possible explanation for the genetic results. She hesitated. The other possibility, she hesitated again, is that something consensual happened before the accident that you're not aware of. I felt like I was drowning. No, there was nothing with Preston, ever. Declan, you have to believe me. But he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at the wall, his jaw working like he was grinding his teeth to dust. My brother visited you 6 times while you were in the coma. I checked the visitor logs. He sat with you for hours when I had to be home with the girls. The nurses said he was devoted, reading to you, playing your favorite music. They thought it was beautiful how close our family was. Security footage, Dr. Kensington said quietly. We need to review every minute of every visit from Preston Garrett. Declan pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Preston's cheerful voice asking to leave a message. Declan didn't. He just hung up and tried again, and again. On the 5th attempt, he finally spoke. Call me back now. It's about Natalie. He hung up and looked at Dr. Kensington. Get that footage, all of it. I want to see every second my brother was alone with my wife. The hospital security office became a war room. Milo Vance pulled up footage from 6 weeks of ICU surveillance. Preston had visited on 6 separate occasions, each visit lasting between 2 and 4 hours. The cameras showed him entering my room, sitting beside my bed, holding my hand. In one clip, he leaned down and kissed my forehead. In another, he was crying, his face buried in the blanket covering me. To anyone watching, it looked like a devastated brother-in-law praying for recovery. Nothing suspicious, nothing criminal. Until the 3rd visit. Vance paused the footage, pointing at the timestamp. This is interesting. The nurse left the room at 8:17 p.m. She didn't come back until 9:43 p.m. That's an 86-minute gap with no one else entering. Hospital protocol says ICU patients should never be unattended for more than 30 minutes. He fast-forwarded through the footage. Preston sat in the chair for the first 20 minutes. Then he stood up, walked to the door, and looked out into the hallway. When he came back, he closed the privacy curtain around my bed. The camera angle doesn't show what happens behind the curtain, Vance explained. It's positioned to monitor the room entrance for security, not to surveil patient care. We can see movement, shadows, but no clear detail. For the next hour, the curtain stayed closed. Shadows shifted behind it. At one point, a shape that could have been Preston leaned over the bed. The monitor beside me showed my vitals spiking, heart rate jumping from 65 to 98 beats per minute, then slowly settling back down. Declan was gripping the edge of the desk so hard his knuckles had gone white. What is he doing behind that curtain for an hour? Vance shook his head. I can't say definitively, but your wife's vitals show signs of physiological arousal, increased heart rate, elevated blood pressure. The patterns are consistent with physical stimulation. He pulled up another screen showing my medical chart from that night. The nurse who came back at 9:43 noted that the patient appeared flushed and the blankets were disarranged. She assumed the brother-in-law had been adjusting her position for comfort. "Pull up the other visits," Declan said through clenched teeth. "All of them. Show me every time that curtain closed." Vance compiled a timeline, 6 visits total. 3 of them included extended periods with the privacy curtain closed and no staff present. Each time, my vitals showed similar spikes. Each time, the nurses noted minor irregularities in their logs. Blankets adjusted. Patient appeared restless. Family member providing comfort. Nothing that raised immediate red flags because Preston looked exactly like Declan, and everyone assumed he had the same rights to privacy with me. Dr. Kensington reviewed the medical data with a growing expression of horror. "On this visit," she pointed to the screen, "your sedation was lighter than usual. We were starting to reduce the medication, testing if you could breathe on your own. There's a note here that you showed signs of agitation, movements that could indicate emerging consciousness. That was the night before Preston's 3rd visit, the night that would align with conception based on the fetal development timeline." She looked at Declan. "I'm so sorry. I think we're looking at sexual assault of an incapacitated patient." "Call the police," Declan said flatly. "Now." Within an hour, 2 detectives arrived at the hospital. Detective Sloane Vaughn and her partner, Detective Julian Rico, took statements from everyone, reviewed the footage, and examined my medical records. Detective Vaughn sat beside my bed with a gentleness that made me start crying. "Mrs. Garrett, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask if you remember anything from your coma. Any sensations, sounds, moments where you might have been aware of your surroundings. Anything at all, even if it seems like a dream." I closed my eyes, trying to pull memories from the fog. There were pieces, voices, sometimes music playing, someone holding my hand. I remember warmth, pressure, feeling safe, which seems insane now. I thought it was Declan, his voice reading to me, telling me about the girls, begging me to wake up. But if it was Preston and he was using that access to assault me while I couldn't fight back or even fully understand what was happening, the words choked off into sobs. Detective Rico made notes on his tablet. "Identical twins present a unique challenge in cases like this. Your husband can't be the father because of his vasectomy, confirmed by medical records, but his brother shares enough genetic material that the baby's DNA shows familial markers. Combined with the security footage showing prolonged unsupervised access and your medical data indicating physiological responses during those visits, we have enough for probable cause." He looked at Declan. "Has your brother responded to your calls?" "No," Declan said. "I've left 8 messages, texted him screenshots of the BNA results. Nothing. He's ghosting me." Detective Vaughn pulled up her phone. "We've contacted military police on his base in Germany. They're bringing him in for questioning. If he refuses to cooperate or tries to flee, they'll detain him." She paused. "I have to warn you both. Cases involving unconscious victims are incredibly difficult to prosecute. His defense will argue she wasn't fully comatose, that there might have been consent we can't verify, that the relationship could have been ongoing before the accident."
"That's disgusting," Declan exploded. "She was in a medically induced coma. She had a breathing tube. She couldn't speak or move. How the hell is anyone going to argue consent?" Detective Rico's expression was grim. "I've seen defense attorneys argue worse. They'll say the medical records show decreasing sedation, that she was responsive to stimuli, that maybe she initiated contact in her semi-conscious state. They'll paint your brother as a devoted family member providing comfort that turned physical with her encouragement. It's vile, but it's effective. Juries have a hard time convicting when there's no clear evidence of force." Dr. Kensington entered the room holding another tablet. "I have additional medical evidence that might help. During the 3rd visit, the one we believe aligns with conception, the nurse documented that Natalie's gown was on backwards when she came back into the room. She'd noted it because hospital gowns are designed to open in the back for easy access to monitoring equipment. She assumed Preston had removed it to adjust the wires and put it back on incorrectly, but looking at it now in context with everything else, it suggests he undressed her." "Show me that footage again," Detective Vaughn demanded. Vance pulled up the relevant section and they all crowded around the monitor. The curtain was closed for 72 minutes during that visit. When Preston finally opened it and left the room, you could see him adjusting his clothes, tucking his shirt in, running his hand through his hair, the gestures of someone who'd just been physically active. Then the nurse entered 3 minutes later and discovered the gown issue. Vaughn turned to her partner. "That's enough for an arrest warrant." The military police detained Preston at his base in Germany within 6 hours. He initially refused to speak without an attorney, which told us everything we needed to know. If he was innocent, if this was all a horrible misunderstanding, wouldn't his first reaction be shock and denial? Instead, his silence felt like admission. Declan collapsed into the chair beside my bed after getting the call, his face in his hands. My own brother, my twin. How could he do this? How could he violate you while you were fighting for your life? I didn't have answers. I was still trying to process that the baby growing inside me was the product of assault, an assault I couldn't remember, couldn't fight against, couldn't even fully comprehend had happened. The violation felt abstract and visceral at the same time, like my body had been used as a vehicle for someone else's crime, while my consciousness was locked away in medicated darkness. Dr. Kensington gently suggested I consider speaking with the hospital's trauma counselor. Given that I was now dealing with both physical recovery and psychological trauma, I'd need support through what was coming next. The trauma counselor was a woman named Dr. Leona O'Coffer, with warm eyes and a voice that made you want to trust her. She sat across from me in my hospital room, her notepad balanced on her knee. "Natalie, what happened to you is a profound violation, and the fact that you can't clearly remember it doesn't make it less real or less traumatic. Your body remembers, even if your conscious mind doesn't. That's why you're experiencing this disconnect, this feeling of unreality. It's your brain trying to protect you from something it can't fully process." I told her about the fragments I did remember: warmth, pressure, the sensation of being touched, but filtered through layers of sedation that made everything feel distant and dreamlike. I thought I was dreaming about Declan, in those foggy moments when awareness would surface and then slip away again. I felt safe, cared for. How sick is that? I felt safe while being raped by my husband's identical brother when I was dying. And I can't even hate the memory properly because part of me still thinks it was Declan showing me love while I was dying. Dr. O'Coffer leaned forward. "That's not sick. That's your brain doing exactly what it needed to do to protect you. You were in a profound vulnerability, and your subconscious created a narrative that would allow you to feel safe instead of terrified. There's no shame in that. The shame belongs entirely to the person who exploited your helplessness."
She paused. "Have you thought about what you want to do regarding the pregnancy? There are options available to you, including termination. No one would judge you for making that choice given the circumstances." I'd been avoiding that question for days. My hand moved to my stomach, feeling the slight swell, remembering the movement I'd felt. This baby was innocent in all of this, but it was also conceived through assault, would always be a reminder of the worst violation I could imagine. Could I love a child created this way? Could I look at them and not see Preston? But then again, I'd look at them and see Declan too, because genetically they were nearly identical. This baby would be my daughter's sibling, share their DNA, belong to our family, even if the conception was a crime. "I don't know," I finally said. "I don't know if I can raise the child of my rapist, but I also don't know if I can terminate a pregnancy that's already this far along, where I can feel the baby moving. It feels like punishing an innocent life for someone else's crime." Dr. O'Coffer nodded slowly. "Those are valid feelings, both of them. You don't have to make any decisions right now. Take time to process, to heal. Talk with Declan about what this means for your marriage and your family. Whatever you ultimately decide, it should be your choice, made without pressure or judgment." Declan and I had that conversation later that night. The hospital had given us the larger family suite, understanding we needed privacy to navigate this nightmare. He sat on the edge of my bed, holding my hand for the first time in days. His eyes were red from crying. "I don't blame you," he said quietly. I want you to know that none of this is your fault. You were unconscious. You couldn't consent. My brother violated you in the most heinous way possible. But I also don't know if I can raise his child, if I can look at a baby that's genetically my nephew and see anything other than betrayal. I understand, I told him, and I don't know if I can either, but we have 12-year-old daughters who are going to have questions we can't avoid answering. How do we explain this to them, that their uncle assaulted their mother while she was in a coma, that they might have a sibling who's also their cousin, that family gatherings will never be the same because we can't ever be around Preston again? Declan's jaw clenched. Preston is dead to me, to our family. I don't care if we share DNA. He's not my brother anymore. The legal process moved forward with mechanical efficiency. Preston was extradited from Germany to face charges of sexual assault of an incapacitated person, a first-degree felony carrying 20 years minimum. His attorney tried to fight the extradition, arguing jurisdiction issues and claiming the evidence was circumstantial, but the combination of security footage, medical records, DNA evidence, and victim testimony was overwhelming. A grand jury indicted him within 2 weeks. His bail was set to $500,000, which his parents paid immediately. Declan's parents. I hadn't thought about them until they showed up at the hospital demanding to see me. Declan's mother, Penelope, was crying when she entered my room. His father, Randall, looked 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. Penelope grabbed my hands, squeezing too tightly. Natalie, you have to know Preston would never do something like this. He's always loved you like a sister. There has to be some explanation, some mistake. The DNA test must be wrong, or maybe something happened before the accident that you've forgotten. Please, tell him it's a misunderstanding before this destroys our entire family. Declan's jaw clenched. Preston is dead to me, to our family. I don't care if we share DNA. He's not my brother anymore. The legal process moved forward with mechanical efficiency. Preston was extradited from Germany to face charges of sexual assaults of an incapacitated person, a first-degree felony carrying 20 years minimum. His attorney tried to fight the extradition, arguing jurisdiction issues and claiming the evidence was circumstantial, but the combination of security footage, medical records, DNA evidence, and victim testimony was overwhelming. A grand jury indicted him within 2 weeks. His bail was set at $500,000, which his parents paid immediately. Declan's parents. I hadn't thought about them until they showed up at the hospital, demanding to see me. Declan's mother, Penelope, was crying when she entered my room. His father, Randall, looked 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. Penelope grabbed my hands, squeezing too tightly. Natalie, you have to know Preston would never do something like this. He's always loved you like a sister. There has to be some explanation, some mistake. The DNA test must be wrong. Or maybe something happened before the accident that you've forgotten. Please tell them it's a misunderstanding before this destroys our entire family. Declan stepped between us, his voice cold. Mom, the DNA evidence is definitive. The security footage shows him closing the privacy curtain and being alone with her for over an hour on multiple occasions. Her medical records show physical responses consistent with sexual activity. There's no misunderstanding here. Your son assaulted my wife while she was in a coma. Penelope's face crumpled. But he's your brother, your twin. You two were inseparable growing up. How can you believe he'd do this? Declan's expression was granite. Because I've seen the evidence, because I believe my wife, and because whatever he was to me before, he's a rapist now. Randall tried a different approach. If this goes to trial, it will destroy Preston's military career, his future, everything he's worked for. And for what? A baby that might not even be his, despite what some DNA test says. Tests can be wrong. Twins can have genetic anomalies. He looked at me with pleading eyes. If you care about this family at all, you'll drop the charges. Say it was consensual before the accident. Say you had a brief affair you regret. Anything that prevents my son from going to prison for 20 years. Get out.
I said. My voice was shaking but firm. Get out of my room. Your son raped me while I was unconscious and unable to defend myself, and you want me to lie to protect him? To destroy my own reputation and marriage? To save his military career? What kind of people are you? Penelope started crying harder. We're trying to save our family, Natalie. Please, you don't understand what this will do to us. The scandal, the shame. Randall works with the county commissioners. I volunteer at the church. We'll be ostracized. Declan physically escorted his parents out of the room, his voice echoing in the hallway as he told them never to contact us again. When he came back, he was shaking with rage. I'm so sorry. I can't believe they actually asked you to lie for him. They're in denial. They can't accept that their golden boy, their military hero son, is capable of something this monstrous. So they're rewriting the narrative in their heads, making you the villain instead of the victim. It's textbook abuse enablement. The hospital released me a week later with strict instructions for bed rest and prenatal care. I was now officially 24 weeks pregnant, past the point where termination was legally available in our state, without medical necessity. Dr. Kensington explained that continuing the pregnancy carried some risks given my recent trauma and extended coma, but nothing immediately life-threatening. The choice remained mine, though my window for choosing was rapidly closing. She referred me to a maternal fetal medicine specialist who could provide more comprehensive counseling about my options. Going home was surreal. The house looked the same, but everything felt different. Declan had explained the situation to our daughters, Sabrina and Gemma, in age-appropriate terms. Their uncle Preston had done something very wrong, something that hurt Mommy, and there was going to be a baby because of it. The girls had questions we struggled to answer. Will the baby live with us? Is Uncle Preston going to jail? Do we still have grandparents? Each question was a knife cutting deeper into the fabric of our family that had been torn apart by Preston's actions. Sabrina, always the more direct twin, asked the question I'd been dreading. Mommy, do you want the baby? I sat on the couch with both girls curled against me, Declan in the chair across from us. Honestly, I don't know yet. It's complicated. This baby is your sibling, and it's innocent, but the way it was created was very wrong, and I'm still figuring out my feelings about all of it. What I do know is that whatever I decide, it will be because I think it's best for our family. And I need you both to understand that none of this is anyone's fault except Uncle Preston's. Gemma, quieter and more thoughtful, looked up at me with tears in her eyes. Can we still love Uncle Preston, even if he did something bad? Or are we supposed to hate him now? The question broke my heart because it wasn't fair. None of this was fair to these two 12-year-old girls who'd almost lost their mother and were now watching their family implode. You can feel however you feel, I told her. Feelings are complicated. It's okay to be angry at what he did while still remembering times when he was kind to you. But we can't have him in our lives anymore. He's not safe. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after my hospital release. Detective Vaughn prepared me for what to expect, explaining that Preston's attorney would try to discredit the evidence and my testimony. They'll argue you were conscious enough to consent, but sedated enough to not remember clearly. They'll suggest you and Preston had a prior relationship your husband didn't know about. They'll use the fact that you can't clearly remember the assaults against you, painting your testimony as unreliable or confused. It's going to be brutal, Natalie. You need to be prepared for that. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with harsh fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sickly. Preston sat at the defense table in a suit, his hair cut short in military style, looking exactly like Declan, except for the expression on his face. Where Declan's eyes showed pain and betrayal, Preston's showed calculation, cold assessment of the situation and how to manipulate it to his advantage. His attorney, a woman named Cassandra Mallory, with a reputation for aggressive defense tactics, barely glanced at me during her opening arguments. Mallory painted a picture of a loving brother-in-law devoted to her comatose sister-in-law's recovery. She showed the security footage of Preston entering my room, sitting beside me, holding my hand. She played audio of him reading to me, his voice gentle and caring. Then she introduced the bombshell. Mrs. Garrett had been reducing her sedation in the days leading up to the alleged assaults. Medical records show she was responsive to verbal commands, able to squeeze hands on request, showing clear signs of emerging consciousness. The defense's position is that any physical contact that occurred was consensual, initiated by a woman aware enough to make her wishes known through nonverbal communication. I felt sick listening to her twist the facts into something that made me complicit in my own assault. The prosecutor, District Attorney Wesley Becker, stood to object. Even if Mrs. Garrett showed signs of emerging consciousness, she was still legally incapacitated and unable to provide informed consent. She had a breathing tube, was confined to a hospital bed, and was under continuous medication that impaired her judgment and memory. The law is clear that sexual contact with someone in that condition constitutes assault, regardless of perceived responsiveness. Judge Clarissa Henderson reviewed the medical records carefully. She was a woman in her 60s known for being fair but tough. After 20 minutes of silence, except for the sound of pages turning, she looked up. "I'm allowing this case to proceed to trial. There's sufficient evidence that a crime may have been committed. However, I'm also ordering a full neurological evaluation of Mrs. Garrett to determine her capacity for consciousness and consent during the period in question. Until we have expert testimony on whether she was capable of understanding and communicating consent, I'm not dismissing anything. Bail remains at $500,000 already posted. Trial date is set for 8 weeks from today." 8 weeks. I'd be 32 weeks pregnant by then, obviously showing a constant visual reminder of the crime we were prosecuting. Declan held my hand as we left the courthouse, reporters shouting questions we didn't answer. His face was set in determined lines. "We'll get through this. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." But I could feel the distance between us growing, a chasm created by circumstances neither of us could control. He loved me, I believed that, but could he love a child conceived through his twin brother's assault of his unconscious wife? The neurological evaluation was conducted by Dr. Raphael Park, a specialist in consciousness disorders and coma recovery. He reviewed 6 weeks of medical records, interviewed my medical team, and conducted extensive cognitive testing on me. His report, delivered in a conference room full of lawyers and experts, was clinically brutal. Mrs. Garrett was in a state of minimal consciousness during the period in question. She showed some responsiveness to external stimuli, but lacked the cognitive capacity for complex decision-making or informed consent. Any movement or response during this time would have been reflexive or instinctual, not indicative of conscious choice or agreement. Ms. Mallory immediately challenged the findings. "Dr. Park, isn't it true that patients in minimal consciousness states can still experience pleasure and pain, can still respond to touch in ways that indicate preference?" He adjusted his glasses. "They can show physiological responses, yes, but response to stimuli is not the same as consent. A person in Mrs. Garrett's condition would not have had the executive function necessary to understand the nature of sexual contact, the implications of such contact, or the ability to refuse unwanted advances. Any sexual activity with someone in that state is, by definition, assault." The words hung in the courtroom. Preston shifted in his seat, and for the first time I saw something crack in his composed facade. Fear, maybe, or realization that his defense was crumbling. The prosecutor seized the moment. "Your Honor, the defense is essentially arguing that my client was conscious enough to consent, but too unconscious to remember consenting. That's an impossible standard that would make prosecuting any assault of an incapacitated victim impossible. The evidence is clear. The defendant had unsupervised access to a vulnerable patient. That patient became pregnant during that access period. DNA confirms the defendant as the father, and medical experts confirm the victim could not have provided meaningful consent. This is assault, period. Judge Henderson called a recess. When we reconvened 2 hours later, her decision was unequivocal. This case is going to trial. The evidence supports a reasonable belief that sexual assault occurred. The defendant will remain free on bail with the conditions that he have no contact with the victim or her family, surrender his passport, and report to pre-trial services weekly. Trial begins in 6 weeks. The gavel struck, and Preston's parents were crying in the back of the courtroom. Declan sat stone-faced beside me, his hands squeezing mine so hard it hurt.
The weeks leading up to trial were a special kind of torture. My body grew with a pregnancy I hadn't chosen, carrying a baby I had complicated feelings about. The twins watched me with worried eyes, seeing their mother change shape with a sibling they weren't sure they wanted. Declan tried to be supportive, but I could feel him pulling away emotionally, unable to reconcile his love for me with his horror at what his brother had done. Our intimacy died completely. He couldn't touch me without thinking about Preston touching me first, violating me while I was helpless. I started seeing Dr. Okafor 3 times a week, trying to process the trauma layered on trauma. The assault itself, the violation of my trust by someone I'd considered family, the pregnancy forcing me to live with the physical evidence of the crime, the trial approaching where I'd have to testify about things I couldn't fully remember while lawyers tried to make me look like a willing participant. And underneath all of it, the baby moving inside me, growing stronger, demanding I make a decision about its future. 28 weeks pregnant, I finally admitted something to Dr. Okafor that I'd been hiding from everyone else. I think I want to keep the baby. I know that's not fair to you that you didn't sign up for raising your brother's child, but it's also my child and our daughter's sibling, and I can't shake the feeling that giving it up or terminating would haunt me forever. I'm not asking you to love this baby or even accept it. I'm just asking you to understand why I need to make this choice. And if you can't, if this is too much, then I understand that too. Dr. Okafor sat back in her chair. Have you talked to Declan about this? I shook my head. I'm afraid he'll leave if I choose to keep it, afraid he'll resent me and the baby for the rest of our lives. But I'm also afraid of the guilt I'll carry if I don't, if I terminate or give up for adoption a child that's half mine, that I've carried and felt move, that's done nothing wrong except exist. How do I make a choice when every option feels like losing something essential? You talk to him, she said gently. You tell him exactly what you just told me. Give him the chance to surprise you. He's shown up for you through this nightmare in ways many spouses wouldn't. Trust that he'll continue to do so even when the path forward is unclear. The worst thing you can do is make this decision alone and then spring it on him. Your marriage deserves honesty, even when honesty is terrifying. So, I scheduled time with Declan that evening after the twins were asleep to have the conversation that could end or save our marriage. We sat in our bedroom, the door closed, both of us tense. I started crying before I even said the words. Declan, I think I want to keep the baby. I know that's not fair to you that you didn't sign up for raising your brother's child, but it's also my child and our daughter's sibling, and I can't shake the feeling that giving it up or terminating would haunt me forever. I'm not asking you to love this baby or even accept it. I'm just asking you to understand why I need to make this choice. And if you can't, if this is too much, then I understand that too. Declan was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I've been thinking about this too, lying awake every night imagining what it would be like to raise a child created through violence against you.
wondering if I could look at them without seeing Preston, without feeling rage at what his brother had done. I keep coming back to one thing. You're the victim here. You're the one who was violated. And if you want to keep this baby, if that's what helps you heal and reclaim your agency, then I support that. It won't be easy. I won't pretend it will. But I love you, Natalie, and I'll love any child you choose to bring into our family, even one conceived in the worst possible circumstances. We held each other and cried until there were no tears left. The decision was made, but the work of accepting it was just beginning. We told Sabrina and Gemma the next morning. Their reactions were mixed. Sabrina, pragmatic as always, asked where the baby would sleep and if she'd have to share her room. Gemma worried about how to explain things to her friends at school. But both of them, in their own ways, seemed relieved that the uncertainty was over. We were keeping the baby. Our family was expanding in the most complicated way possible, but we were doing it together. The trial began on a Monday morning in late October. I was 32 weeks pregnant, unmistakably showing, walking into the courtroom with Declan beside me and our daughters at home with his sister. The jury looked at my belly, at Preston sitting at the defense table looking stoic, at Declan whose face was a mask of controlled rage. The prosecutor's opening statement was direct. This is a case about power and violation. The defendant used his physical similarity to his twin brother to gain access to a vulnerable woman in a coma. He then sexually assaulted her on multiple occasions while she was unable to consent or defend herself. The result is the pregnancy Mrs. Garrett is now carrying. Physical evidence of a crime the defense wants you to believe was consensual. But consent requires consciousness, understanding, and choice. The victim had none of those things. Miss Mallarmy's opening was equally direct. This is a case about a family tragedy being criminalized. The defendant visited his sister-in-law out of love and concern during a medical crisis. Any physical contact that occurred happened during a time when medical records show she was emerging from her coma, responsive to stimuli, and capable of indicating her wishes through movement and sound. The prosecution wants to paint my client as a predator, but the evidence will show he's a devoted family member who's being punished for caring too much in a relationship that the victim, in her compromised state, participated in and encouraged. I wanted to scream, but Detective Vaughn had prepared me for this. They're going to make it sound like you wanted it, like you initiated it. Don't react visibly. Don't give them anything to use against you. Stay calm, stay factual, and trust that the evidence will speak for itself. So I sat there, hands folded over my pregnant belly, while Preston's attorney described me as a willing participant in my own assault. The prosecutor called witnesses methodically. ICU nurses who testified about my level of sedation and unresponsiveness. Dr. Kensington explaining the medical impossibility of meaningful consent in my condition. The security director showing footage of Preston's visits and the suspicious gaps in supervision. Then came the geneticist, Dr. Lydia Chow, who explained the DNA evidence. The baby Mrs. Garrett is carrying shares 50% of her genetic material, as expected for any child. The paternal DNA shows markers consistent with the defendant's genetic profile. Given that the defendant is an identical twin to Mrs. Garrett's husband, who has a confirmed vasectomy, the only possible explanation is that the defendant is the biological father. This pregnancy occurred during the time Mrs. Garrett was in a medically induced coma, specifically during the window when the defendant had unsupervised access to her. Day 3 of the trial, I took the stand. The prosecutor guided me through my testimony gently. I described the accident, waking up from the coma, discovering I was pregnant, finding out about the DNA results, and realizing Preston was the father. The fragments of memory I had from the coma that I'd mistakenly attributed to Declan, but now understood were Preston exploiting his identical appearance. My voice shook through most of it, but I got the facts out. The jury was watching me with expressions ranging from sympathy to skepticism. Then came Miss Mallory's cross-examination.
Mrs. Garrett, you testified that you have fragmented memories from your coma, sensations of being touched, feelings of warmth and safety. Isn't it possible you were more conscious during these encounters than you remember? That you responded to Mr. Preston Garrett's presence in ways that indicated desire or consent? I felt my face flush. I was in a medically induced coma with a breathing tube. Even if I had moments of partial awareness, I couldn't speak, couldn't move meaningfully, couldn't make informed decisions about what was happening to my body. But you felt warmth and safety, Miss Mallory pressed. Those are positive emotions. Doesn't that suggest you weren't experiencing assault, but rather welcomed intimate contact? I gripped the edge of the witness box. I thought it was my husband. Preston looks exactly like Declan. He used that similarity to violate me while I was unconscious. Any positive feelings I had were based on mistaken identity and manipulation of my sedated state. That's not consent. That's exploitation. The prosecutor objected, and the judge sustained it, but the damage was done. The defense had planted the seed that maybe I'd wanted it, maybe I'd participated, maybe this was all a tragic misunderstanding rather than deliberate assault. The defense called their own expert, Dr. Gareth Morton, a neurologist who testified that patients in minimal consciousness states can show preference and make basic choices. Under the right circumstances, he claimed, someone in Mrs. Garrett's condition could have indicated willingness for intimate contact through body language and physiological responses. The prosecutor tore him apart on cross-examination. Dr. Morton, how exactly does someone with a breathing tube, confined to a hospital bed under heavy sedation, communicate informed consent to sexual activity? He stammered something about reflexive responses and instinctual behavior, but it was clear his testimony was bought and paid for by the defense. Preston never took the stand. His attorneys advised him to invoke his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, which the judge instructed the jury not to interpret as guilt. But everyone knew what it meant. If he had an innocent explanation, he'd give it. His silence was its own admission. Closing arguments lasted an entire day. The prosecutor methodically walked through the evidence, connecting every piece into an undeniable picture of assault. The defense tried to muddy the waters, suggesting reasonable doubt based on my fragmented memories and the complexity of consciousness during coma recovery. The jury deliberated for 3 days, 72 hours of waiting while my future and Preston's hung in balance. Declan and I stayed home with the girls, trying to maintain normalcy, while my phone stayed glued to my hand, waiting for the call. When it finally came, Detective Vaughn's voice was carefully neutral. They have a verdict. The courthouse is expecting you within the hour. We drove in silence, my hands shaking so badly I had to sit on them. The courtroom was packed when we arrived. Media, victims' advocates, Preston's parents in the back row glaring at us like we'd betrayed them. The jury foreman stood. On the charge of sexual assault of an incapacitated person, we find the defendant guilty. Preston's face went white. His mother screamed. Declan's hand found mine, squeezing hard enough to bruise. Judge Henderson thanked the jury and set sentencing for 3 weeks out. Preston was remanded into custody immediately, his bail revoked. As they led him away in handcuffs, he looked at me for the first time since the trial began. No remorse in his eyes, just cold hatred that I dared to speak up, to press charges, to refuse to protect him the way his parents had. Sentencing day, I was 35 weeks pregnant, so close to delivery that my doctor had advised against attending. But I needed to be there, needed to give my victim impact statement and watch Preston face consequences for what he'd done.
Judge Henderson listened to both sides present arguments about appropriate punishment. The prosecutor asked for the maximum, 20 years. The defense asked for leniency, claiming Preston's military service and clean record warranted a reduced sentence. Preston's father actually testified, begging the judge to consider the family impact, the shame they'd already endured, the punishment of having their son's life destroyed.
Then it was my turn. I stood at the podium, one hand on my pregnant belly, the other gripping my prepared statement. Your Honor, Preston Garrett violated me in the most fundamental way possible. He used his physical similarity to my husband to gain access to me while I was unconscious and unable to defend myself. He assaulted me multiple times, knowing I couldn't remember, couldn't fight back, couldn't even understand what was happening. The pregnancy I'm carrying is physical evidence of his crime, a daily reminder of violation that I'll see in my child's face for the rest of my life. I'm choosing to keep this baby not because I've forgiven what Preston did, but because this child is innocent. But make no mistake, Preston Garrett is not. He deserves the maximum sentence allowed by law. Judge Henderson took less than 5 minutes to decide. Mr. Garrett, you committed one of the most heinous violations possible. You exploited a vulnerable woman's incapacity to serve your own desires, and you did so repeatedly with premeditation and calculation. The evidence showed you closed privacy curtains to hide your actions, timed your visits for minimal supervision, and exploited your physical similarity to the victim's husband to gain access. This was not a moment of weakness or poor judgment. This was predatory behavior. I sentence you to 20 years in state prison with no possibility of parole. You'll also be required to register as a sex offender upon release and are permanently barred from contact with the victim or her family. Preston was led away. His parents were sobbing. Declan pulled me close, and I felt the baby kick hard against my ribs, as if acknowledging the moment. Justice had been served, but it didn't erase what happened, didn't make the pregnancy less complicated or my feelings less confused. It just meant Preston would face consequences for using my unconscious body for his own gratification. As we left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions about how I felt, whether I'd forgiven Preston, what I planned to name the baby. We didn't answer any of them. 3 weeks later, at 38 weeks pregnant, I went into labor. Declan held my hand through 18 hours of contractions, never leaving my side. When they finally placed my son in my arms, I looked down at his face and saw something I hadn't expected. Not Preston, not even Declan, really, just a baby, my baby, innocent and perfect, and completely separate from the circumstances of his conception. We named him Oscar, a name that belonged only to him, untethered from family history or painful associations. Sabrina and Gemma came to visit, hesitant at first, then melting when Oscar wrapped his tiny hand around their fingers. Declan held him and cried, and I knew we'd be okay. Different than before, scarred by what happened, but together, a family rebuilt from trauma into something stronger and more honest than we'd been before. 6 months later, with Preston serving his sentence and our family finding its new normal, I looked at Oscar sleeping in his crib and knew I'd made the right choice. Not an easy choice, but mine.